I am happy to say that I'm part of a newly formed division at GFGL called Marine Ecosystems and Downscaling. And I get to kind of dabble in both sides of that, both the large scale global ecosystem questions that we have with our Earth system model, but also doing regional development of our MOM6 or Modular Ocean Model version 6 for the Northeast Pacific. So I'm going to talk about that today and also emphasize some of the lessons learned and things we've been focusing on as I've developed that model for publication. So I always start my talks off with this picture. It's by Douglas Alden from SIO. It's the Scripps Pier, and it's showing, you see this black ribbon here in the water, and I believe this is anchovy. And it just is a nice illustration of how a lot of these important biological processes that we're interested in studying are happening very close to the shore and at very small scales. And that Scripps Pier is conveniently about 1/4 of a kilometer long. So that sort of underlies the motivation I have for looking at like regional models and using them when we are trying to address marine resource questions. So big picture, a lot of the industrial fisheries are pulling in fish and catch from the nearshore environment along the coastal region. This is just an illustration using Tickler et al. 2018, showing the amount of fish and where it's coming from in the world. And what is important with looking at the coastal resolution is that as you get more resolved, like finer details, you're able to bring out these important processes that are relevant to these living marine resources. So if you're looking at the global model, what I have on the right there is Townsend et al. 2006. It's one of our earlier versions of the GFDL global model, and it's showing along the northeast coast of the US. And then below it is the CM 2.6, Delworth et al. 2012, and we have a much better resolution, if you can see, of the Gulf Stream along our east coast. And obviously, that's a very important feature for us to be getting right in our models, but it's challenging when you're thinking about, okay, I need to run this really high resolution model. They're quite costly. So that's what we get from increasing the resolution. So this is an example using Jason Holt's 2016 paper where we're looking at the Irish Seas in Europe. And so the global model, what we can gain by increasing that resolution, not just the features, but we can also end up with entirely different changes. So this is a climate change projection, and the global model shows this decrease in overall productivity. But then when you bring in aspects such as the tides and the really dynamic or really diverse bathymetry in this region, it actually changes the entire trend. Like the sign of that trend goes from increasing when you're looking around that particular like yellow outlined region. And so, we get a lot of value out of downscaling, but we have these models that are also incredibly highly resolved. Like we have the ESM 2.6, it's got 10 kilometer for the global ocean resolution, and it is incredibly expensive to run the entire planet or the entire global ocean at these very high resolutions, let alone try to generate ensembles to ask questions about, like how is the climate going to change, or how is climate change going to affect ocean ecosystems. So we like to use these regional ocean models so that we can start to generate these large ensembles of many different tests of how the Earth system might change or doing forecast, because they're not as computationally expensive. So there's value in running those regional, having that high resolution, but also value in not running the entire global ocean. So we had a paper recently, not so recent anymore, but 2021, where we wrote up some recommendations for designing regionally downscaled simulations, specifically for the application of living marine resource management decisions. And it had a huge team involved. And what we really, just to broadly go over what we covered, was looking at the historical trend in downscaling studies, specifically climate change, ocean downscaling studies. And we're finding there, there's more studies, more models are being used over time. The number of studies that are using BGC and recognizing the importance of biogeochemistry in interpreting implications for marine resources, and then the number of ensemble members. We recognize that a single ensemble member doesn't fully give you a sense of the variability or uncertainty of the system. But a lot of these studies are were kind of proof of concept. They weren't necessarily for a specific application, and that kind of comes in later, why that's really important when you consider how we're going to be using them. So we came up with a protocol essentially listing out the important steps to consider. And I don't necessarily need to go through all of it, but when we are designing these climate change ocean downscaling studies, these are some of the considerations we wanted to take into account. So in particular, you want those experiments, you want the design, your configuration to really be able to get the variables and the scales and the features that are really important to address the stakeholder management needs. So if you need to have some understanding of, for example, ocean acidification and how that might change over time or its variability, obviously you would need to include a biogeochemical component to your model. Additionally, what resolution do you need? Sometimes you actually can resolve the important features at moderately coarse resolution. You don't need to go to sub-kilometer levels. So it's good to ask yourself, like, okay, can I get this to be close enough? Because sometimes it's, you know, it looks really cool to have these incredibly high resolution videos or movies of our simulations, but in reality, you still might be able to get the exact same answer at a coarser resolution. So it's good to be frugal in terms of exactly how much you need. Bias correction was another one that we were recommending because if you downscale a biased Earth system model, you're going to have a biased downscaled result. And then lastly, just being mindful of like the time horizons you need for management and whether it's enough to actually have like a time slice or whether you need the whole transient signal of how the Earth system or that ocean system has evolved over time. So we like to use those time slices when it's adequate to just say, here's what the last 10 years have been versus the last 10 years, for example, of the end of this century. And sometimes that's adequate, and other times we really need to have a sense of that changing system over time. So these are all kind of wrapped together to consider when you start to make and put together a model and when you're designing these experiments. And a lot of this we are considering and making these recommendations in support of NOAA's Climate Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative. So big picture and effort to have these operational ocean models that can support decision making in the future, whether that's for doing shorter term forecasts, seasonal to decadal, or long-term climate change projections. And it's a big effort going on right now, and more people are coming onto our team, which we're really excited about. But the NEP model, which I'm working on the Northeast Pacific Regional MOM6 model, is one of 3 large efforts going on to really cover all of the US coastal regions. We've got Andrew Ross leading the Northwest Atlantic model, and then Kate Hedstrom at University of Fairbanks leading the Arctic Ocean model. So together, those 3 different model domains cover our continental US and Alaskan coastlines. We also have a group that's working on the Hawaiian Islands as well. So for the rest of the time, I was just going to give some information about the NEP model. I'm working on the documentation paper right now and hoping to have that done within the next 2 months or so. And it's been a very interesting process to like get to work with this huge team of oceanographers who are developing really the model code, and then people who are thinking more about the ecosystem dynamics and what metrics we really need to be capturing. And it's fascinating to go back and forth and say, okay, well, we need this, and bring this information between the 2 groups or the 2 different types of stakeholders and developers in these models. So this is the extent of my domain. I usually tell people I think of regional modeling much like a recipe in baking. You have your like configuration, and then you have how long you run it for, and a lot of times it blows up the first few times around, and it takes time, it takes practice. But for this NEP model, our resolution is roughly 10 kilometers in the horizontal. We're using the Modular Ocean MOM6. It's the ocean component of GFDL's Earth System model. and the current one that we've been submitting to the CMIPS project. And the run we're doing now is roughly 30 years, 27 to 30 years. We're using the ERA 5 reanalysis for the atmospheric forcing. Boundaries are prescribed using the GLORAS ocean reanalysis, and then river runoff is coming from the Global Flood Awareness System, GLOFAS. The BGC model is cobalt. And then the configuration is we have one-way atmospheric forcing. We've got the physics, the BGC, and sea ice. So that's sort of my configuration or my recipe for how we are running this ocean model. And what I've got here in the animation is just the daily sea surface temperature for the year of 1994. And it looks cool. That was why I put it up there. But it's just to illustrate that the level of detail we're getting with the eddies and the upwelling along the California current, what's going on, in the Bering. It's a really large domain for a regional ocean model. So a lot to look at and a lot going on. So for our documentation paper, I have to demonstrate that this model is doing a reasonably good job across this domain, reproducing the different features that we consider to be important for different living marine resources and management decisions. So this figure is showing one suite of assessments we're doing. Most of these are like surfaces or layers in the ocean. Starting at the top, we're looking at the sea surface height compared to the GLORAS reanalysis again. On the left is always the NEP MOM6 result. In the middle is the gridded observation product or the reanalysis, whatever we're using as our baseline comparison that we think is going to have a reasonable estimate of what we think is the truth. And then the difference on the far right. So just going down, we do the sea surface height. Next row is sea surface temperature. The following row is the annual mean sea surface salinity, and then the bottom one is the mixed layer depth. And generally speaking, we're pretty happy with the results. I don't use particularly flattering color bars here for the differences, but having the salinity being between 1 and -1 and our differences, and we're seeing a really low biases near the really strong river inputs. So that's kind of encouraging that we're reasonably representing the mean state of the system, especially if you're looking at not necessarily the difference plot, but first starting off looking at the absolute state. We feel pretty confident we're reproducing the broad scale features. Some things we might be looking at to improve would be the mixed layer depth, that bottom one looking offshore, and we've been tuning the mixing parameterization to try to get the right level of mixing to be representative of the region. And then also, I've done a lot of work on the inputs from the rivers. So for example, in the Gulf of Alaska, with the GLOFAS reanalysis, GLOFAS has pretty good performance in terms of river runoff globally speaking, but regionally, especially in the Gulf of Alaska and areas where there's inputs of glacial melt, we were missing some of the trends that we were anticipating seeing there that is consistent with warming temperatures indicating more river runoff. So we patched into our river runoff and discharge, freshwater discharge product in observation, or more closely related to observation product by, I think it was a Beamer et al. Product and Hill et al. Just so that we're making sure we're really getting this freshwater input in the Gulf of Alaska to be as reasonably accurate as we could expect. So going on to looking at salinity, now what I'm doing is looking from north to south, looking at the salinity profiles with depth. So each column or each row, as I progressively move downward, is a latitude further south. And why I'm interested in this is because of the transport and movement of water masses in the California current system, as well as the Gulf of Alaska. So there's that bifurcation of the North Pacific current. And then you have different water masses that are being advected along the coast, depending on where you are. And I'm just using salinity here. We're going to use a more advanced analysis of those water mass properties in our paper. But for the time being, just comparing on the left, I've got the NEP MOM6 results compared to the GLORAS reanalysis. And ultimately, again, we're pretty happy with how this is looking. As we are in the north, you've got the freshwater inputs in the Gulf of Alaska that might be a little strong near the coast, but we're actually thinking that, maybe that's okay, that may not actually get captured that well in GLORAS. So we're not too concerned about the freshwater biases in the further northern latitudes. But as you're moving further south, I'm seeing more of this like saltier water coming into the domain. So that might be indicative of just maybe a little too much of our Pacific equatorial water at that particular latitude. So we're going to keep that in mind and see, like, just to make sure those water masses are partitioning where we expect them to. But overall, we're pretty happy with how this looks. And then the next thing that we're really, want to make sure we get right, especially when we start thinking about the forecasting, we want to make sure we're starting from a baseline that is reasonable. Like we are capturing the variability that has happened in the past to a reasonable extent. So what we've done here is we've split up the domain into 5-6 different sections, 5 US sections, and we also have British Columbia as well. And we are comparing the performance relative to the GLORIS reanalysis in terms of time series for bottom temperature and surface temperature. And that's specifically to get at questions like how does it look on time frames or frequencies like the ENSO scale, on PDO, just interannual variability. So we're specifically looking at the anomaly. We subtracted out the monthly mean climatology, and then we are doing comparisons against the time series for these specific regions. So I'm just going to go slide by slide each individual region for comparison. So starting with the Bering Shelf, it looks really great. On the top plot, it's surface, and the bottom is bottom temperature in terms of the 2 time series. And then NEP's in blue, GLORIS is in orange. And we're pretty happy with that correspondence in terms of a correlation, coefficient of about 0.98, 0.92. As we move further south, we start to see that those numbers begin to decline. They're not too bad. So I'm going to move next to the Gulf of Alaska. Again, still pretty high correlation. But as we get down to, BC, it's still up in the 90s and the 80s for the surf and the bottom respectively. But when we get into the California current system, as we move south through there, that's really when we start to see like, okay, we're going to have a reduced correlation. Now we do have really great match when we look at like the 1998, 1999, the El Nino La Nina transition phase. There's that really big spike in the bottom temperature, and that persists pretty well. But like in some years, what we're seeing in the time series is that it becomes a bit less connected. So in particular, like the Central California current system, and then the Southern California current system, we're having our R value in the bottom is getting down to 0.55. Now, on the one hand, I'm not too concerned about that because as we've moved to those different domains, we have less and less shelf that we're dealing with. So there's fewer and fewer grid cells that are contributing to this time series calculation. So on the one hand, the Bering Sea, for example, had many grid cells that were contributing to that anomaly time series, and it performed very well. And then as we've been moving further south, just the nature of how I've been defining this area, I've been looking, by the way, from 50 to 1,000 meters, just because we want to be looking at these regions where organisms may be on the shelf, on the bottom, and interacting with the benthos and things like that. And as we've moved further south, there's less shelf available in these domains that I've defined. On the other hand, I was showing how that Pacific equatorial water seemed to be perhaps more prevalent as you move further south in those depth transects. So that's another consideration as well, that might be seeing more of the variability emphasized here by a different water mass. So we are keeping that in mind. So the last few slides I have are looking at some more like fishery specific metrics that are of interest to us. This is a comparison of the hypoxic boundary layer. So this is the depth layer at which we think it might have biological significance to organisms. It's where the concentration of oxygen transitions from, above 61.7 to below 61.7 micromoles per kilograms. And on the left, I have our regional MOM6 simulation for the entire 1993 to 2019 period of our hindcast. And then on the right, I have World Ocean Atlas. Generally speaking, World Ocean Atlas seems to have it a bit deeper out in the middle of kind of like the Pacific. But overall, we're pretty happy with how the distribution is looking, and thinking that, going forward with future projection scenarios, that it would still be relevant to those investigations and answering questions about how we expect this feature to particularly change over time. And then another aspect we've been looking at is specifically the bottom temperature in the Bering. Now, I talked about the time series before, but why we're interested in this is its relevance to particular fisheries. Now, we did a firsthand comparison. We took the bottom temperature for June through July, comparing it with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center's bottom trawl data. But the issue here, obviously, it looks like our extent of the bottom temperature is not really matching up well with these really specific observations. It's farther north, that 2 degrees Celsius line is really what we're interested in terms of the fishery boundaries. But the data for the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, it's time varying. So like they're not taking time samples for that trawl data at the same, frequency that we do for NEP MOM6. Like this is daily output versus the trawl data is when they happen to get through the domain to get the annual bottom temperature data and groundfish survey. So what we actually ended up doing is doing specific, like spatiotemporally consistent temperature sampling of the model to match when the observations are taken. And we find actually it's still biased a little warm, which would be consistent with a more northerly bottom, cold pool extent, but probably not as bad as we were thinking it was, because the just making sure we're lining up the space and time sampling is probably giving us better results relative to what we're seeing in the observations. So also feeling pretty good about that. We are working with our colleagues at Alaska Fisheries Science Center and at PMEL. They're also running the NEP model and trying to optimize specifically for the Bering Sea, see if there's anything in particular we should be doing. And then I think this is my last slide. This is looking at chlorophyll in the California current system. So, and again, a metric, an important aspect of our upwelling system that we have on the West Coast. And this is more qualitative at present, but what we're seeing is reasonably good reproduction on the left using the NEP MOM6 cobalt output, comparing it to the satellite product that we're comparing against in terms of what is that climatological chlorophyll signal that we would expect in the California current signal. So pretty happy with that. We do have some updated data we have to, or output that we need to evaluate against, but it's looking good so far. So that's it. Just a broad overview for what we want for regional downscaling simulations. Just make sure we're adequately representing the features and variables, the things we need to study. It's one of those make sure the tool is fit to task situations. And then overall, we're pretty pleased with how NEP MOM6 as this first iteration of the hindcast is going. Personally, going forward with MOM6 and NEP model development, there's a few aspects of the model that I'm really excited to see evolve. One of them is dynamic parameterization of this variable, the mixed layer eddy front length term, because it varies spatially and temporally, and to have that, really dynamically in the model, I think would help with some of our mixing issues that I've been tuning. And then also getting a W diagnostic for vertical velocity that's not currently produced by the model, and it would be really useful for doing like upwelling analyses. Those two things, I'm not the one who gets to do them. That's our ocean group and fellow developers. I'm just saying that's like my Christmas list request for MOM6. And then I'm hoping to develop more finely resolved iron deposition forcing from the atmosphere, which is really important in the Gulf of Alaska, especially considering when we have a lot of fires that happen on the Pacific Northwest and Central California coast. And from there, my future work with the model is going to be running CMIP6 scenario projections with NEP. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions we have time for.
Thank you, Liz, for a very nice talk. I was interested in some of your time series plots. You showed SST and bottom temperature, and we've been looking at global simulations with the coarse 1 degree, but also we've done some high resolution global at about a 10th degree. So I think that's similar to what you've been doing. And we also found a good representation, say, of the surface temperature, forced, in our case, forced by JRA 55. And kind of an interesting thing is when you do these area averages, like I think you did, we find that both the low res and the high res are quite good. So, and I think it depends on time scale as well. We were looking at monthly averages, but some things, you can do okay with the coarse resolution model. Say you're looking at a large area average, then maybe the coarse resolution model is sufficient. But there's probably, I'm sure there's other metrics like EKE and things like that where you need a high resolution model. So I thought that was interesting, and just kind of making that point.
Yeah, I would imagine, especially as you get to those near shore regions where you're limited in the terms of the number of grid cells you're selecting for your comparison area, that your coarser models are going to have even fewer grid cells that meet that criteria of that depth range. And it's averaging, the closer you can get to the coast, the more detail you can get in there, obviously. So I would imagine that as you make that a more strict criteria and getting more up against the coastal features along California and whatnot, you start to lose that in some of the ESMs. Like things get filled in and they're just not as detailed.
Liz, thank you for presenting. Very interesting. I have a question about the Bering region. So,
Sure.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So you use GLORIS as the boundary condition. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And remind me, what is the resolution of GLORIS quarter degree?
1/12 of a degree.
Oh, 12 degree.
Mhm.
Okay. So 12 degree, yeah, it's much better. So in the Bering Sea, we have Bering Strait, which is a very narrow strait, as you know.
Mhm.
It's in the order of 40, 50 kilometers wide, right? So in your model, it's only 4 grid points, and GLORIS probably have maybe in the order of 15 points. From my experience, I worked with a model much higher resolution than that, in the order of 1 kilometer, and even with 1 kilometer resolution, we've had problems correctly reproducing the flow through the Bering Strait. It's a very challenging region for modelers. Have you looked at Bering Strait inflow, outflow, temperature, salinity, volume, how well it is captured in your model and GLORIS model compared to observations and high resolution reanalysis?
Right. So that is, we do worry about that, how it's representing it. We do not set the boundary at the Bering Strait.
Okay.
We actually set it further into the Chukchi Sea so that it's actually generating the solution internally further away from that boundary. But you make a really good point. I need to actually check that. Essentially, it's a boundary for my analysis, and I'm not really focusing on the Chukchi because I assume that Kate Hedstrom's model of the kind of Pan-Arctic domain it's a more appropriate model to be using for analyzing that region. But it's still a valid point. I need to go back and I need to check what we have for that straight flow just as a criteria in general for evaluating. But because we were concerned about that being a boundary condition, we actually moved the boundary quite a bit further away from there. So it still begs the question, are we doing it well? But rather than having that be a boundary itself, we expanded it outward further north.
Okay, thank you.